My name is David Reeves, and at 82 years old, I'm running out of time to keep this inside. For 42 years, I carried a secret through every season, every storm, every lonely mile of that forest. I buried it deeper than I buried my own regrets. A creature most of you would call Bigfoot, though that word never came close to what he truly was, lived under my protection from March of '82 until the day he died last November. And the moment I released the truth, the government showed its teeth. Before I go, you deserve to know what they did and what we both lost. March 18th, 1982. Late winter in the Shasta Trinity National Forest, where the snow was finally giving way to mud and the runoff creeks were running fast and brown. I was 40 years old, a ranger with the U.S. Forest Service, and I was doing what I did most days back then, staying as far from other people as possible. I was stationed out of a remote ranger post near the Trinity Alps, checking boundary markers and taking water samples from Mill Creek, where it cuts through a stand of Douglas fir about 8 miles north of Highway 299. The work was routine, deliberate, the kind of thing that kept my hands busy and my mind quiet. I had a clipboard, a dozen glass sample bottles, and a thermos of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours earlier. The forest smelled like wet pine bark and thawing earth. I was kneeling beside the creek, labeling my third sample bottle with a grease pencil, when I heard it, a sharp metallic clatter, then a sound that stopped me cold, a low, pained bellow that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the earth. It was too resonant for elk, too powerful for bear, the kind of sound you feel in your sternum before you hear it with your ears. Then the smell hit me, copper and iron mixed with wet fur and something else I couldn't name. Blood, a lot of it. I stood up slowly, my knees cracking, and looked upslope toward a thick tangle of manzanita and madrone about 60 yards east. The bellow came again, weaker this time, followed by a wet, labored breathing that carried through the trees like wind through a cave. My first thought was bear. We'd had reports of illegal trapping in the area for weeks. Poachers using old spring traps, the kind that could take a leg clean off if the animal struggled long enough. I'd found 2 black bears that winter, both dead, both with shattered limbs still clamped in rusted steel jaws. I pulled my radio off my belt and keyed it twice, then thought better of it. If this was another poacher's mess, I wanted to see it first before I called it in. Document it properly. Make sure the evidence was clean. I moved upslope, following a trail of broken branches and deep drag marks in the mud. The manzanita had been pushed aside in a wide swath, like something big had crashed through without caring what it destroyed. I could see dark stains on the leaves. Fresh blood, still wet. The breathing got louder, ragged, conscious. I came around a fallen cedar log, maybe 4 feet thick, and that's when I saw the leg. It was massive, covered in coarse ash-brown fur that was matted with blood and mud. The foot alone was the size of a dinner plate, with toes that flexed weakly against the ground. And clamped around the lower part of the leg, just above what I can only describe as an ankle, was a bear trap, a big one. The steel teeth had bitten deep, and I could see bone. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. My brain kept trying to fit it into something I understood. Bear. Elk? Moose, maybe, though we didn't have moose this far south. Then the thing moved. It was slumped against the far side of the cedar, half hidden in shadow, but when it shifted, I saw the shape of it, the breadth of the shoulders, the length of the arms, the curve of the spine, and then it opened its eyes. They were dark, almost black, with small flecks of green near the pupils that caught the filtered sunlight. But it wasn't the color that stopped my heart. It was the intelligence in them, the focus, the unmistakable awareness of what was happening. This was not an animal. It looked at me for what felt like an hour, but was probably 3 seconds. Then, slowly, it lifted one hand. Not in threat, not in defense, just lifted it. The hand was enormous, easily the size of a canoe paddle, with thick fingers and nails that were cracked and dirty. It held the hand there, trembling, and then let it fall back to the ground in what I can only describe as exhaustion or surrender. I should have run. I should have called it in immediately, gotten every available ranger and probably half the county sheriff's department out there within the hour. That's what protocol demanded. That's what any reasonable person would have done. But I didn't. Because when I looked at that hand, I saw the rope burns around the wrist, deep raw marks where something had been tied tight and struggled against, and I realized this creature hadn't been caught by a poacher's trap while wandering through the forest. It had escaped from something, from someone, and now it was dying. I took a step closer. The creature's eyes tracked me, but it didn't move. Its breathing was getting shallower. I could see the massive chest rising and falling in short, painful bursts. "Easy," I said. My voice sounded strange in the quiet. "Easy there." The creature blinked slowly. Then it did something that made my decision for me. It lifted that enormous hand again, and this time it pointed. First at the trap clamped around its leg, then toward the deeper forest to the east, then back to itself. It was asking for help, not demanding, not threatening, asking. I looked at those eyes again and saw something I recognized. I'd seen it in the mirror every morning for the past 4 months, ever since my younger brother Michael died in a logging accident just after Thanksgiving. I'd seen it in the face of every wounded animal I'd ever tried to save, and in the faces of people who'd lost something they couldn't get back. I saw fear, and loneliness, and the kind of desperate hope that comes from having nothing left to lose. I knelt down next to the trap. "This is going to hurt," I said, even though I had no idea if it could understand me. "But I'm going to get you out." The creature made a sound, low and almost musical, like a cello's deepest note held for just a moment. I chose to believe it was agreement. I worked the trap's release mechanism with both hands, my fingers slipping on blood-slick metal. The springs were old but strong, and it took everything I had to pry the jaws apart. When they finally opened, the creature pulled its leg free and made a sound I'll never forget. Not a scream, not a roar, something closer to a sob. I sat back on my heels, breathing hard, and watched as it cradled the ruined leg against its chest. The injury was bad, worse than I'd thought. Bone was visible through the torn flesh, and the bleeding was steady. This thing was going to die without medical attention, real medical attention. And the moment I reported this, the moment I brought anyone else into this clearing, this creature's life would be over in a different way. Labs, cages, experiments, or worse. I thought about Michael, about how he'd spent his whole life trusting the wrong people, following the wrong rules, and it got him killed at 36 under a widowmaker pine that should have been marked for removal weeks earlier, but wasn't because someone in the logging company didn't want to slow down production. I thought about every time I'd trusted the system to do the right thing, and how many times it had failed. And I made a choice that would define the next 42 years of my life. I was going to hide this creature, protect it, keep it alive, not because I thought I could save it, but because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try. You have to understand why I did what I did, why I threw away every bit of training, every regulation I'd spent 20 years following, every logical reason to call for backup and let someone else handle this. My brother Michael's middle name was Caleb. He died on November 29, 1981, 3 days before his 37th birthday, when a rotted pine snapped during a routine timber harvest in Del Norte County. The company knew the tree was compromised, the foreman knew, but the quota needed to be met, and Michael was the kind of guy who did what he was told without asking too many questions. They found him pinned under 800 pounds of trunk, his hard hat 20 feet away, his thermos still warm with the coffee he'd poured that morning. I was the one who identified the body. After the funeral, I requested transfer to the most remote posts available. I stopped returning calls from friends. I let my apartment in Reading go and moved into the ranger station full-time. I wanted distance, from people, from responsibility, from the weight of caring about anyone or anything that could be taken away. And then, 4 months later, I found something in a trap that looked at me with eyes that said, "Please." And every protective instinct I'd been trying to bury came roaring back. I named him Caleb. I don't know why I did it right then, kneeling in the mud next to a creature that might have been dying, but the name just came out. "Okay, Caleb," I said, "let's get you somewhere safe." He made that low, musical sound again. I took it as acknowledgement. There was an old fire weather observation post about 2 miles northwest, built in the 1950s and abandoned since '76 when they upgraded to a tower system. It was nothing fancy, just a small wooden structure with a potbelly stove, a cot, and shuttered windows. But it was off the trail network and too far from the main roads for casual hikers. More importantly, it was in my patrol sector. I could access it without raising questions. Getting Caleb there was another problem entirely. He could barely stand, let alone walk 2 miles through rough terrain. I had to improvise. I used my belt and a length of paracord from my pack to create a makeshift tourniquet above the wound, then helped him lever himself upright using the cedar trunk for support. He was heavy. I'm talking 800, maybe 900 pounds of muscle and bone and determination. When he put his hand on my shoulder to steady himself, I felt the weight of it clear down to my boots. But he moved, slowly, painfully, leaning on trees and stopping every 20 yards to breathe. He moved. It took us 4 hours to cover 2 miles. By the time we reached the observation post, the sun was setting and my shirt was soaked through with sweat despite the cold. Caleb collapsed on the floor inside the doorway and didn't move for 10 minutes except to breathe. I used my first aid kit, meant for treating minor cuts and bee stings, to clean a wound that probably needed 60 stitches and intravenous antibiotics. I packed it with gauze, wrapped it with every elastic bandage I had, and prayed to a God I wasn't sure I believed in anymore that infection wouldn't set in. Then I sat against the wall and watched him sleep. That's when the reality of what I'd done started to sink in. I'd just committed to hiding a creature that science said didn't exist. I had no plan, no resources, no idea if he'd even survive the night. All I had was a promise I'd made to myself in a moment of grief-fueled clarity. I would not let the system destroy something vulnerable just because it didn't fit into neat categories. I would protect him, whatever it took. The next morning, I radioed in that I'd found evidence of illegal trapping and would be conducting extended patrols in the northern sector for the next week. My supervisor, a guy named Holland, who spent most of his time in Sacramento and didn't care what the field rangers did as long as the paperwork was clean, approved it without question. I spent that week shuttling between my duties and the observation post. I brought food, canned stew, jerky, apples, anything I could carry without raising suspicion. I brought blankets. I brought a Coleman lantern and extra batteries. And I watched Caleb heal. He was stronger than I'd imagined possible. By day 3, the wound had stopped bleeding. By day 5, he was putting weight on the leg. By day 7, he was standing without support and examining the contents of the observation post with careful, deliberate curiosity. He touched everything: the potbelly stove, the shutters, my ranger jacket where I draped it over the back of a chair. He'd pick things up, turn them over, set them down gently. When he found my compass, he spent 20 minutes watching the needle swing, moving it closer and farther from the stove to see how the metal affected it. He understood cause and effect. He understood tools. And when I showed him how to open the shutter latches from the inside so he could get fresh air without me having to do it, he learned it on the first try. I started leaving him notes not because I thought he could read, but because it felt important to communicate. Back tomorrow morning, stay quiet. I'd sketch little pictures, a stick figure of me, an arrow pointing away, then pointing back. The sun rising. On the 8th day, I came back to find he'd arranged the notes in chronological order on the floor, weighted down with pebbles. That's when I understood what I was really dealing with. This wasn't just an unknown primate. This was someone. Someone with memory, with intention, with the capacity to understand that I was trying to help. Someone who was completely, utterly alone. Spring turned into summer, and I developed a routine that would define my life for the next 4 decades. I mapped out every inch of my patrol sector and identified 17 locations that were remote enough to serve as hiding spots. The observation post was good for now, but I knew Caleb would eventually need to move. Too many visits to one location would create patterns, and patterns got noticed. I started falsifying reports. When I found his tracks near the post, I logged them as black bear. When his fur snagged on branches, I collected it and disposed of it miles away, replacing it with elk hair from a shed I found near Caribou Lake. I became an expert at misdirection, at creating false trails and phantom explanations for anything that might raise questions. The poachers were still active that summer, which actually worked in my favor. Every time I found one of their traps, I'd radio it in and use the heightened patrols as cover for my own movements. If anyone asked why I was spending so much time in the northern sector, I could point to the ongoing investigation. By June, Caleb was mobile enough to follow me during my patrols. He stayed back, always at least 100 yards away, moving through the forest with a silence that seemed impossible for something his size. I started to understand how these creatures had stayed hidden for so long. He knew the landscape in a way that went beyond familiarity. He knew where to step, where the sight lines were, how to use terrain and shadow to become invisible. He taught me things without meaning to. How to read the forest the way he did. How to spot disturbances in the patterns of wildlife that meant human presence. How to move without leaving evidence. We developed a communication system. 3 low whistles meant all clear. 2 short chirps meant danger, stay hidden. 1 long descending tone meant I'm here. He picked it up faster than I could teach it. In late July, I had my first real close call. A rookie ranger named Patterson, fresh out of training and eager to prove himself, found a set of tracks near Mill Creek. Massive prints, clearly bipedal, pressed deep into the mud near a berry thicket. He radioed it in with barely contained excitement. "Holland, you need to see this. I think we've got a Bigfoot situation." Holland laughed it off, told him it was probably just a bear with an unusual gait, but Patterson was persistent. He took plaster casts. He measured the stride length. He started talking about calling in a wildlife biologist from UC Davis. I volunteered to investigate with him. We spent 3 days covering the area, and I made sure every new track we found could be explained away. I planted bear scat near the clearest prints. I showed him how black bears sometimes walk upright when they're injured or carrying food. I found an old trail camera that had caught a bear reaching for berries and played up the angle to make it look almost human. By the end of the week, Patterson was convinced he'd made an honest mistake. Holland told him to focus on the illegal dumping problem near Highway 3 and stop chasing fairy tales. I felt sick about it. Patterson was a good kid, and I'd essentially gaslit him into doubting his own eyes. But the alternative was worse. That summer, Caleb started bringing me things. Small offerings left near the observation post or along trails where he knew I'd find them. A cluster of wild ginger roots, a shed deer antler perfectly preserved, a smooth river stone with a vein of quartz running through it. I didn't understand the significance at first. Then one evening in late August, I was sitting outside the post watching the sunset, and Caleb emerged from the tree line carrying a branch he'd stripped of bark and sharpened to a point using rocks. He'd made a tool, not a weapon, a digging implement. He set it down next to me, tapped it twice, then pointed at the ground near my boots where wild onions were growing. He was showing me how to forage more efficiently. I laughed. Actually laughed for the first time since Michael's funeral. "You trying to teach me survival skills, buddy?" Caleb made a sound I'd started to recognize as contentment. A low rumble in his chest, almost like a cat's purr but deeper. He sat down across from me, his long arms resting on his knees, and we watched the sun go down together. That's when I realized what was happening. I wasn't just protecting him anymore. We were becoming something I didn't have a word for. Not friends exactly. That seemed too simple. But not just ranger and wounded animal either. We were keeping each other company in the loneliness. Winter of 1983 hit hard. We got snow in October, and it didn't let up until March. The observation post became unusable, too risky with snowmobilers and cross-country skiers venturing into areas that were deserted the rest of the year. I moved Caleb to a natural cave system I'd found during a survey the previous year, about 6 miles northeast, in a granite formation that was hell to access but completely hidden from trails. I stockpiled supplies there, canned goods, blankets, a battery-powered radio so I could track weather patterns, medical supplies in case the leg injury flared up again. Caleb adapted. He'd disappear for days at a time, foraging on his own, but he always came back. I'd find signs he'd been there, rearrange supplies, new caches of nuts and roots, small arrangements of stones that seemed decorative rather than functional. In January, during a particularly brutal cold snap, he saved my life. I'd been checking one of the remote snow depth stations when a storm rolled in faster than forecast. Whiteout conditions, temperature dropping to 15 below, wind that cut through my gear like I was wearing nothing. I got disoriented, lost the trail, and started making the kind of mistakes that kill people in the wilderness. I was stumbling through waist-deep snow, my hands numb, my thoughts getting fuzzy when I heard it. That long, descending tone. "I'm here." Caleb appeared through the snow like a ghost, massive and impossibly warm. He took my arm, not roughly but firmly, and led me to an overhang I'd never seen before. There was a small fire there, barely smoking, built with dry wood he must have been storing. He'd been tracking me, watching. And when he saw I was in trouble, he intervened. We spent the night there, huddled together for warmth while the storm raged outside. At some point, I fell asleep against his shoulder, too exhausted and cold to care about the absurdity of the situation. When I woke up, the storm had passed and Caleb was gone. But there was a deer hide draped over me, something he must have been saving, and a pile of Douglas fir boughs arranged to keep me off the frozen ground. I made it back to the ranger station by noon. When Holland asked where I'd been, I told him I'd holed up in one of the emergency shelters. He didn't question it, but I knew the truth. I'd gone into that forest to protect Caleb, and somewhere along the way, he'd started protecting me. By 1986, our relationship had settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal, if you could call any of it normal. Caleb had a territory he moved through, a circuit that took him about 2 weeks to complete, and I'd learned to predict where he'd be based, on the season and food availability. We'd meet up every few days, sometimes just passing each other with a whistle, sometimes spending hours together while I did paperwork and he watched or foraged nearby. In May of that year, I was collecting water samples near a meadow where the wildflowers were just starting to bloom when I heard something crashing through the brush behind me. I turned to see a black bear, maybe 300 pounds, charging straight at me. I don't know what I'd done to provoke it. Maybe I'd gotten too close to cubs I hadn't seen, or maybe it was just having a bad day. I barely had time to raise my arms when Caleb appeared from nowhere and stepped between us. He didn't attack the bear. He just stood there, all 8.5 feet of him, and made a sound I'd never heard before. It was loud enough to hurt my ears, deep enough to vibrate in my chest, and it carried an unmistakable message. Back off. The bear did. It stopped mid-charge, skidded in the dirt, and took off in the opposite direction like it had remembered somewhere else it urgently needed to be. Caleb turned to me, touched my shoulder gently, made his contentment rumble, and walked away into the forest. My hands were shaking for an hour afterward. But the incident created a problem. 2 hikers had been in the area, far enough away that they hadn't seen what happened, but close enough that they'd heard the vocalization. They reported it to the ranger station, describing it as like a bear, but wrong, bigger and deeper. Then they found the tracks, both sets. The bear's and Caleb's. Patterson, who was still with the service and still nursing dreams of discovering something significant, drove out that same afternoon. By the time I got there, he'd already made casts of 3 prints and was talking excitedly about getting them analyzed. I spent the next week systematically destroying his investigation. I found bear tracks elsewhere in the area and made sure they got more attention. I brought in a wildlife biologist I knew from college, a guy named Chen, who owed me a favor, and had him write a report attributing the sounds to mating elk. I even staged evidence of a large bear den in a location that made Caleb's tracks look like they were heading away from human areas rather than toward them. It worked, but it took years off my life from stress. That was the year I started to understand the real cost of what I was doing. It wasn't just the lying or the constant vigilance. It was the isolation. I couldn't get close to anyone because I couldn't share the most significant part of my life. I couldn't date, couldn't maintain friendships, couldn't trust anyone enough to let them in. In 1987, my supervisor Holland retired and was replaced by a woman named Marchant who actually cared about fieldwork and started doing surprise inspections of remote stations. I had to get creative, develop new protocols, create entire systems of misdirection just to keep my patterns from looking suspicious. I turned down a promotion that would have moved me to a district office in Eureka. I turned down another one in 1989 that would have put me in management. People started to notice, started asking why a ranger with my experience was content to stay in the field, working the least desirable posts year after year. I told them I liked the solitude, liked the work, wasn't interested in politics or paperwork. It was all true, but it wasn't the real reason. The real reason was a creature who brought me wild ginger and river stones, who saved my life in a snowstorm, who stepped between me and danger without hesitation. The real reason was that I'd made a promise, and I wasn't going to break it. In the fall of 1990, Caleb showed me something I still think about almost every day. We were deep in the backcountry, past any maintained trails, in an area I'd marked on my personal maps as Old Growth Study Area to justify my presence there. Caleb led me through a section of forest I'd never noticed before, where the trees grew in strange patterns and the understory was unusually clear. We came to a grove of ancient cedars, their trunks so massive it would take 4 men linking hands to encircle one. And at the base of the largest cedar, partially hidden by ferns and moss, was a structure. Not natural, not human, something in between. It was made of woven branches and bark, built into a natural hollow in the cedar's root system. The engineering was sophisticated: angled supports, water channels to direct runoff, carefully selected materials that would last. But it was old, decades old, maybe longer. The branches were gray with age, the bark integration seamless. Caleb stood at the entrance and made a sound I'd never heard before. It was mournful, full of grief so deep it seemed to come from the earth itself. He went inside, and I followed. There were 5 depressions in the ground, each roughly the size and shape of a sleeping body. 5 beds, carefully maintained, covered with layers of bark and dried moss. On a natural shelf formed by an exposed root, there were objects: stones arranged by size, bones carved with simple patterns, a piece of what looked like obsidian worked into a crude blade, evidence of a family. Caleb touched each depression, one by one, making that mournful sound. Then he sat in the largest one and put his face in his hands. I understood then. This was where he'd come from. This was his clan, his people. and they were gone. I don't know what happened to them. Disease, maybe? Or hunters? Or they simply moved on and he got separated. But the grief in that grove was palpable, heavy as smoke. I sat with him for 3 hours while he mourned. I didn't say anything. What could I say? Instead, I just stayed, present, bearing witness to a loss so profound it transcended species. When we finally left, as the sun was setting through the cedars, Caleb turned back once and made a sound that was different from the mournful one. It was lower, softer, final. It was goodbye. After that, something changed between us. The relationship deepened in a way that's hard to articulate. It wasn't just companionship anymore. We'd become each other's family, the only family either of us had left. He started sleeping closer to my ranger station, in a hollow I'd helped him build using salvage timber I'd officially logged as removed for fire prevention. When I had nightmares about Michael, which I still did regularly, I'd sometimes wake to find Caleb sitting outside my window, keeping watch. When he got injured, a nasty gash on his arm from a barbed wire fence in 1992, he came straight to me instead of treating it himself. I stitched it up using a curved needle and fishing line, and he sat perfectly still through the whole thing, trusting me completely. We were bound together by secrecy, by loss, by the strange miracle of connection across an impossible divide. The 1990s brought new challenges. Technology was advancing faster than I could adapt. Trail cameras were getting cheaper and more common. Hikers carried better cameras. In 1995, someone got footage on a camcorder of what they swore was a large primate moving through trees near Trinity Lake. The footage was blurry, inconclusive, but it made the local news. I had to move Caleb farther out, into territory that was harder for me to access regularly. By then, I was in my 50s, and the wilderness was getting harder on my body. My knees were shot. I'd broken my left wrist in a fall in '93, and it never healed quite right. But I kept going, because what else was I going to do? Abandon him? In 1997, we had the worst fire season I'd seen in my career. Lightning strikes sparked blazes that merged into complexes, covering thousands of acres. Smoke jumpers and hotshot crews came in from all over the West. The forest was crawling with people, aircraft, equipment. Caleb should have been terrified, should have retreated into the deepest wilderness he could find. Instead, he stayed close to my sector. One night in August, I was doing a patrol check on a fire line we'd cut to contain a blaze near Monument Peak. The wind shifted unexpectedly, and I found myself watching a crown fire develop in real time, flames jumping from treetop to treetop, moving faster than a person could run. I was radioing for evacuation when I saw him. Caleb, in the firelight, systematically removing deadfall and debris from a corridor that led downslope towards safety. He was creating a break in the fuel, the same thing we'd do with hand tools and chainsaws, but he was doing it with his bare hands. I joined him. For 2 hours we worked side by side, him pulling entire dead trees out of the ground, me clearing the smaller stuff. By the time the fire reached us, there was a gap just wide enough to slow it down. The flames dropped from the canopy to the ground, where we could fight them. The fire crew that arrived 30 minutes later found me exhausted and alone, covered in soot, standing in front of a corridor that didn't make sense to them. "How'd you cut this?" one of them asked. "Chainsaw," I lied. "Been working on it for hours." They didn't question it. They were too grateful. But later, a smoke jumper found tracks in the ash. Big, deep, clearly bipedal. He took photos, showed them around, started asking questions. I told him they were mine, that I'd been working without my boots on because they'd melted in the heat. It was absurd, but he was young and tired and willing to accept any explanation that didn't require more paperwork. Those photos disappeared from his pack 3 days later. I don't know what happened to them. I didn't ask. By the early 2000s, I was getting old. So was Caleb. I could see it in the way he moved, the gray spreading through his fur, the way he favored his right side where that old trap injury had left permanent damage. We'd been together for 20 years, more than half my life as a ranger. And I was starting to realize that this couldn't last forever. In 2003, the Forest Service started a comprehensive wildlife DNA survey. They were collecting hair samples, scat, anything that could be analyzed. The goal was to track population genetics of bears, elk, mountain lions. But the technology could identify unknowns too, and Caleb left evidence everywhere, no matter how careful we were. I spent 6 months intercepting samples before they got logged. I'd volunteer for collection duties, swap out anything suspicious with samples I'd collected from known species. I became an expert at identifying Caleb's hair versus bear hair at a glance. Coarser, darker at the root, with a different texture. I probably destroyed a dozen legitimate samples that would have rewritten biology textbooks. The guilt of that still keeps me up some nights. But the alternative was unthinkable. By then, I'd seen what happened to discovered species. I'd watched black bears get collared and tracked until they changed their behavior patterns. I'd seen wolves that were released with such fanfare become paranoid, stressed, shadows of what they should have been. Caleb wasn't a specimen, he wasn't data. He was a person, and I would not let him become a project. In 2007, I was offered early retirement. I was 65, had more than 30 years in, and my body was screaming at me to stop. But retiring meant leaving my sector, meant losing my justification for being in the forest, meant losing my ability to protect Caleb. I declined. My supervisor thought I was crazy. Maybe I was. I stayed on, taking lighter duties, working part-time, anything to maintain my access and keep my patterns from changing too much. The late 2000s brought drones, first military, then civilian. By 2010, you could buy a decent camera drone for a few $100, and people did. Tourists, researchers, filmmakers, all of them sending these things buzzing through the wilderness. I started tracking drone activity the way I used to track poachers. I'd note when they were scheduled to fly, where they'd be, and make sure Caleb was nowhere near those areas. In September of 2012, I failed. A National Geographic crew was filming a documentary about old-growth forests, and they'd gotten permission to use drones for aerial footage. They were supposed to stay below 6,000 feet. They didn't. Their drone caught something on camera. Just a few seconds, barely a glimpse, but it was enough. A large figure moving through a clearing, upright, too big to be human. The footage made it to the editing team before I even knew it existed. I called in every favor I had. I contacted the crew through official channels, explained that they'd captured footage in a restricted wildlife area and that any imagery from that sector had to be reviewed by the Forest Service before publication. It was bureaucratic nonsense, but I sold it hard. They sent over the raw footage, all 40 hours of it. I spent 3 days going through it, found the 30-second clip that showed Caleb, and corrupted the file. Then I corrupted the backup. Then I claimed there had been a server error and the files were unrecoverable. National Geographic was pissed. They threatened to sue. But in the end, they had bigger projects and better footage, and the whole thing quietly went away. That was close enough to give me a heart attack. Literally. I had chest pains for a week afterward, thought I was dying. Turned out to be severe stress. The doctor told me I needed to retire, reduce my stress load, take it easy. I told him I would. Another lie. Because Caleb needed me, and after 30 years together, I needed him too. The 2010s were hard in different ways. I was in my 70s, dealing with arthritis that made walking difficult, and hands that shook when I tried to write. Caleb was slowing down too. He didn't travel as far, didn't move as silently. His breathing was labored sometimes, and he developed a limp that never quite went away. We were getting old together. I officially retired in 2015 at 73 when they finally insisted I couldn't work even part-time anymore. But I bought a cabin near my old patrol sector, and I stayed. Local people thought I was just a stubborn old ranger who couldn't let go. They were right, just not the way they thought. Caleb visited less frequently, but when he did, the visits were longer. He'd spend hours near my cabin, sometimes sleeping in a shelter I'd built in the woods behind my property, sometimes just sitting within sight of my porch. In the winter of 2017, we had a mutual understanding that he'd moved into what I called his final territory, a stretch of wilderness about 3 miles from my cabin where he'd established a routine. I'd visit him every few days, bringing fruit and vegetables from the store, things that were getting harder for him to forage. We'd sit together, not doing much. I'd talk to him about my day, about the news, about nothing in particular. He'd make his contentment rumble and sometimes touch my face gently with one massive finger, like he was making sure I was real. In 2019, I had a panic attack during a thunderstorm. I've never handled them well, too many memories of Michael's accident happening during one. I was alone in my cabin, hyperventilating, when I heard that familiar whistle outside. Caleb was there, standing in the rain. He didn't come inside. My cabin was too small, the doorframe too narrow, but he stood at the window and pressed one hand against the glass. I put my hand up on the other side. We stayed like that until the storm passed and my breathing normalized. After that night, I started to notice the role reversal. He was watching out for me more than I was watching out for him. When I struggled on the trail, he'd slow his pace. When I forgot things, which was happening more often, he'd gently redirect me. We'd become each other's caretakers. November 14th, 2024. That's the day it ended. I hadn't seen Caleb for 5 days, which was unusual. I'd been trying to reach him with our whistle signals, but getting no response. My gut told me something was wrong. I found him at the Cedar Grove, the one where he'd shown me his family's nest so many years before. He was lying in the largest depression, the one that had been his, and he was breathing in slow, shallow movements. I knelt beside him. "Hey, buddy," I said, my voice cracking. "What's going on?" He opened his eyes, those same dark eyes with green flecks that I'd first seen 42 years earlier. But they were cloudy now, tired. He lifted one hand and touched my cheek, so gently it was barely a brush of contact. Then he made his contentment rumble one last time. I stayed with him for 6 hours. I held his hand, as much of it as I could hold. I told him everything I should have told him years ago, that he'd saved my life in more ways than one, that he'd given me purpose when I'd had none, that loving him, protecting him, knowing him, had been the greatest privilege of my entire existence. He died peacefully, just as the sun was setting through those ancient cedars in the place where his family had once lived. I've never felt anything like that grief. It was oceanic, bottomless, the kind of loss that rewrites who you are. I buried him there, in that grove. It took me 3 days of digging in frozen ground, but I wasn't going to leave him exposed. I wrapped him in every blanket I owned and marked the spot with stones from the creek where we'd first met. Then I went home and I broke every rule I'd followed for 42 years. I scanned every photo I'd secretly taken over the decades. I transcribed sections of my journals, 42 notebooks filled with observations, sketches, moments. I compiled everything into a document and I posted it online. I didn't do it for fame. I didn't do it for vindication. I did it because Caleb deserved to be remembered as more than a myth, more than a story people told around campfires. He deserved to be known as real, as someone who lived, who grieved, who protected, who loved in whatever way his species understood love. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The post went viral within hours. Cryptozoology forums, news outlets, social media, everyone wanted a piece of it. Some people believed me, most didn't. But the noise was loud enough to attract attention I hadn't anticipated. 48 hours after I posted, there was a knock on my door. 3 federal agents, not Forest Service, not Fish and Wildlife, something else, some agency with credentials that looked official, but names I'd never heard of. They were polite, professional. and absolutely terrifying. They confiscated my journals, my photos, my computer. They confiscated samples of Caleb's hair I'd kept, a tooth he'd lost in 1998, everything. They asked me questions for 6 hours straight, recording everything, taking notes. Then they gave me papers to sign. Non-disclosure agreements, consent forms for voluntary cooperation, documents that essentially made everything I'd experienced classified. I refused to sign. That's when their tone changed. They told me they'd been tracking the subject since 1985, that they'd known about Caleb for nearly 40 years and had made the decision to leave him alone as part of a long-term observational study, that I'd been, in their words, a useful control variable. I'd thought I was protecting him. They'd been watching both of us the entire time. They showed me evidence, satellite imagery from 1992 showing thermal signatures they'd cataloged, audio recordings from 2001 that matched vocalizations to our location, drone footage from 2016 that they'd captured and never shared. They'd known. The whole time, they'd known. Why, I asked? Why let him live? Why not capture him? The lead agent, a woman named Torres, looked at me like I was a child asking why the sky was blue. Because he was the last one, she said, and we wanted to see what would happen. The last one. Caleb hadn't been separated from his clan. His clan was dead, likely had been for decades. And the government had known, had documented it, had watched him live out his entire life alone, had watched me care for him, and had done nothing. Not because they respected his existence, but because he was more valuable as an isolated specimen than as a refugee species. Torres leaned forward. You need to understand, Mr. Reeves, the public cannot know that a species this close to human existed in U.S. territory and went extinct on our watch. The implications are untenable. Religious, political, scientific. It would be a catastrophe. So you're covering it up, I said. We're managing information, she corrected. Your online post has been flagged as a creative fiction piece. Your evidence has been examined and found inconclusive. Your credibility has been, regrettably, called into question due to age-related cognitive decline. I'm not signing anything, I repeated. Torres smiled. It wasn't kind. You already did, Mr. Reeves. When you accepted your federal pension, when you agreed to post-employment confidentiality clauses, when you accessed restricted areas during your tenure, you signed away your right to disclose classified observations decades ago. You just didn't know that's what you were doing. They left that evening, took everything with them, told me I was free to live my life quietly, that no charges would be filed as long as I ceased public discussion of the matter. I asked what would happen to Caleb's remains. Torres paused at the door. They'll be studied, properly documented, and then stored in a facility where they can contribute to science without causing public panic. He has a name, I said. Caleb. His name was Caleb. She nodded. Once? Then she left. They exhumed him 3 days later. I wasn't allowed to be there. I'm recording this now because I'm 82 years old, and I don't have much time left. The federal government can flag it, discredit it, bury it alongside Caleb's body in whatever black site facility they've chosen. But I need to say this while I still can. For 42 years, I protected someone who trusted me, who saved my life, who gave me purpose when I'd lost everything. And I failed him. Not because I didn't try hard enough, not because I didn't care enough, but because the system I thought I was protecting him from had been watching the whole time, waiting, documenting his extinction while I played my small part in their long observation. They were right about one thing. The public isn't ready to know that we shared this continent with another species of hominid, that they lived in our forests and our mountains, that they had culture and intelligence and families, and that we watched them disappear without lifting a finger to save them. Because that knowledge would require us to confront something unbearable, that we are not alone in our capacity for thought, for feeling, for society. And more than that, it would require us to confront our failure, our choice to prioritize our comfort, our certainty, our dominance, over the survival of something irreplaceable. Caleb was the last of his kind. He lived alone for decades, carrying grief I can't imagine, and he still chose gentleness. He still chose trust. He still chose to protect me when he could have simply vanished into the wilderness and let me fend for myself. He was better than us, better than me. I wasn't protecting a creature from humanity. I was protecting humanity from recognizing the last shred of its own humility. The government will say this is fiction. They'll say I'm a lonely old man seeking attention in my final years. They'll point to the lack of evidence, to the convenient fact that everything I documented has been confiscated or discredited. And maybe that's fine. Maybe the story is more powerful than the proof. Because somewhere, right now, someone is walking through a forest and they'll hear something they can't explain. They'll find tracks that don't make sense. They'll catch a glimpse of something in the shadows that makes them question everything they thought they knew about the world. And maybe they'll remember this story. Maybe they'll choose differently than the people who watched Caleb's species go extinct. Maybe they'll choose protection over exploitation, wonder over certainty, humility over dominance. That's what I'm hoping for. That's why I'm telling you this. Not because I need you to believe me, but because Caleb deserves to be remembered as more than a myth, more than a monster, more than a government file in a classified database. He deserves to be remembered as someone who lived with dignity, who grieved with depth, who loved in the only way he knew how. And for 42 years, it was my honor to know him. My name is David Reeves. I'm 82 years old. I was a U.S. Forest Ranger for 33 years in the Shasta Trinity National Forest. And I'm telling you the truth, even if no one believes me. Especially if no one believes me, because some truths are worth telling anyway.